When conservative commentator Ben Shapiro backed Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez into an inescapable mathematical corner on live television with just 3 simple questions, he exposed a fiscal black hole that Dorothy Chen, a 7th grade math teacher, saw coming from a mile away right in her Bronx living room. The lawmaker, who boasts 8.6 million devoted followers and stands as the undisputed face of the Green New Deal, froze like a deer in the headlights, finding herself entirely incapable of defending the financial reality of her own signature legislation. It is one thing to rally a base on social media, but it is another entirely when you are asked to perform the basic arithmetic your sweeping policies demand, and she simply could not deliver. Watching this spectacle unfold from her home was Dorothy, armed with nothing more than a sharpened pencil, who managed to do exactly what the Congresswoman could not. Modern political theater often relies on emotional manipulation and carefully curated optics, yet this specific debate stage offered zero sanctuary from cold, uncompromising reality. Gone were the grand marble pillars, the waving flags, and the sympathetic galleries of spectators that typically insulate elected officials from genuine scrutiny. Instead, the environment consisted solely of 2 podiums, a neutral moderator, and 4 cameras positioned uncomfortably close to capture every flinch and hesitation under the unforgiving glare of flat studio lighting. That kind of illumination is relentless. It strips away the shadows where political spin usually hides, which proves particularly devastating when the face in the spotlight has clearly run out of answers. Let us be crystal clear here. Polished optics cannot salvage a fundamentally flawed premise. Dorothy, at 61 years old, had spent 34 years teaching mathematics in the precise public school district the Congresswoman represented. Across those 3.5 decades, she maintained a rigorous habit that her husband playfully dismissed as a quirk, but which she fiercely defended as a fundamental professional duty. Whenever a public figure threw out a statistic on television, she documented it, not out of partisan loyalty, but out of a profound respect for empirical truth. Numbers, unlike the politicians who peddle them, do not carry inherent biases, agendas, or emotional baggage. Just 1 day prior, during a routine classroom lesson on fractions, a student named Marcus raised his hand to ask a remarkably pertinent question regarding how much the Green New Deal would actually cost the American taxpayer. Dorothy lacked a concrete answer at that moment, but as she settled into her chair tonight, with a cup of tea resting beside her, she was determined to extract a definitive metric. She informed her husband, who was distracted by a paperback book in the adjacent room, that her sole objective for the evening was to track the data. Drawing a firm line down the center of her ruled paper, she labeled the left column for Shapiro and the right for the Congresswoman, and she waited. The dynamic on stage materialized immediately as Ocasio-Cortez claimed her space at the podium with the polished posture of someone who had meticulously reverse-engineered the art of commanding a camera lens across thousands of social media broadcasts and cable news hits. Her shoulders were set back, her chin was angled precisely, and her hand gestures were carefully calibrated to convey passion without crossing into theatricality on a 65-inch screen. She opened her remarks by rhetorically asking the audience if they desired an economy functioning for everyone or merely for the elite few in the room, utilizing a strategically timed pause. That hesitation was undeniably rehearsed, a calculated technique honed much like a vocalist perfects a vibrato, molding natural instinct into a weaponized political tool. She declared her sweeping environmental proposal was not merely a policy blueprint, but a moral imperative, asserting that the wealthiest nation on earth held an obligation to guarantee clean air, pristine water, lucrative employment, and a sustainable planet to every single citizen. By framing her ambition as a solemn promise rather than a radical departure from reality, she welcomed the radical label if it meant delivering on those vows. This generated swift, warm applause from a crowd primed to validate her rhetoric. However, soaring moral rhetoric rarely balances a federal budget. Standing opposite her was Ben Shapiro, clad in a slightly oversized suit with his yarmulke secured by a simple bobby pin. His arms rested casually at his sides, and his expression carried the quiet patience of an analyst waiting for an opponent to finish constructing a fragile house of cards he fully intended to dismantle. Acknowledging her passion, he immediately pivoted to his core advantage, speaking with the rapid, articulate cadence of a mind perpetually racing to translate complex data into digestible arguments. He proposed they strip away the emotional veneer and focus entirely on the foundational mathematics. Setting the terms of engagement, he frankly admitted his lack of legislative authority, congressional committees, or subpoena power, gesturing to the barren stage to underscore his point. He was simply a citizen with a microphone, armed exclusively with questions, and he demanded the Congresswoman answer them, not with sweeping declarations or rehearsed monologues, but with hard data. Staring directly at her, he asked point blank for the total price tag of the Green New Deal. She instantly deflected the inquiry, characterizing the proposal as a non-binding resolution. Refusing to let the pivot land, Shapiro acknowledged its legislative status, but reiterated his demand for a concrete financial estimate. The Congresswoman attempted to obscure the issue further, arguing the financial burden hinged entirely on the scope of future implementation. Tension spiked as Shapiro pressed harder, maintaining a level tone while accelerating his pacing. He demanded any figure, a baseline, a projected range, literally any numerical value that a working-class math teacher in the Bronx could theoretically jot down in her living room. Back in that very living room, Dorothy poised her pencil over the right side of her paper, eagerly awaiting a definitive metric. None materialized. With the weary precision of an educator who had spent 34 years grading incomplete assignments, she etched a small, meticulous question mark onto the page. The first crack in the facade had officially appeared. Ocasio-Cortez eventually cited an estimate of $93 trillion published by the American Action Forum, only to preemptively dismiss it as a fabricated exaggeration peddled by a conservative think tank. Shapiro immediately seized the opening, leaning into his microphone to ask if she possessed an alternative calculation. He methodically dismantled her defense, pointing out that as the primary sponsor who built her entire political identity on this framework, it was intellectually bankrupt to lack a proprietary cost analysis, whether from her own staff or an allied organization. Her voice sharpened, taking on a combative edge designed to generate viral sound bites for the next news cycle. She argued that broad conceptual frameworks cannot be priced. Only specific legislative bills can. This represents a classic political dodge, treating severe economic realities as minor administrative details to be sorted out later. Shapiro countered instantly, asking if she had a price tag for any of those subsequent legislative pieces. What followed was a brief, agonizing half-second of silence. Shapiro caught that hesitation with the reflexive speed of a seasoned infielder, turning a double play, recognizing the vulnerability before the audience even processed it. He definitively stated that her silence was the only answer required. He laid bare the inherent arrogance of demanding that 330 million citizens drastically alter their daily lives, transportation, energy consumption, and employment while simultaneously refusing to provide a single financial projection. He criticized her for outsourcing the economic heavy lifting to organizations she publicly smeared, exposing a profound lack of diligence. Straightening his posture, he offered to perform the calculations for her by presenting 3 rapid-fire binary questions. First, he asked if she supported universal health care, to which she agreed. Second, he inquired about a federally guaranteed jobs program, securing another affirmative response. Finally, he questioned her commitment to achieving net zero emissions by the year 2050, receiving a third consecutive yes. With the dispassionate tone of an auditor reading a balance sheet, Shapiro began tallying the unprecedented expenditure. He cited universal health care at approximately $3 trillion annually. He placed the federal employment guarantee somewhere between $500 billion and $2 trillion, depending on the specific economic model. He then noted that the most conservative, serious estimates for reaching net zero emissions hovered between $5 and $10 trillion over a 25-year period. He concluded she had casually endorsed between $15 and $93 trillion in unprecedented new government spending, rendering her previous claim about unpriceable frameworks entirely absurd. He successfully quantified her agenda in under 30 seconds using her own policy priorities. This moment illustrates exactly where ideological daydreams inevitably collide with the uncompromising wall of reality. Meanwhile, Dorothy documented the staggering figures, writing $3 trillion plus $2 trillion plus $5 trillion equals a minimum of $10 trillion. She aggressively underlined the word minimum. Glancing at the opposing column, she saw it remained a desolate void occupied only by that solitary question mark. Turning to a fresh page, she wrote a piercing question demanding to know where the Congresswoman's data was hiding. Back on stage, Ocasio-Cortez attempted to reclaim the moral high ground, her pitch rising as she accused her opponent of reducing the survival of humanity to a mundane spreadsheet calculation. She painted apocalyptic visions of a submerged Miami, a burning California, and asthmatic children, framing the debate as an existential crisis rather than an accounting problem. She argued prioritizing fiscal details over these looming catastrophes revealed a deeply flawed worldview. The audience responded with a subdued, hesitant murmur, entirely lacking the enthusiastic conviction of their earlier applause. It was the sound of a crowd collectively realizing that moral posturing does not pay the bills. Shapiro allowed the room to settle, displaying a rare moment of deliberate slowness. He agreed the issue, carried moral weight, but delivered a devastating counterpunch. The highest moral obligation a governing body holds before extracting wealth from its citizens is transparently explaining the total cost. He pointed out the fundamental injustice of expecting a working-class waitress in Queens earning $35,000 annually or a dedicated Bronx teacher making $58,000 a year to subsidize an initiative its own architect could not quantify. He firmly rejected the notion that noble intentions grant politicians a free pass to ignore basic mathematics. Essential causes demand rigorous financial scrutiny precisely because the burden falls on the working-class backbone of the country, who deserve absolute transparency before being handed an astronomical bill. Hearing her own demographic invoked on national television, Dorothy halted her pencil. The pundit on the screen had no idea she was watching, yet he spoke directly to her daily reality. Comparing the data-rich left column to the barren right side of her paper, she recognized a universal truth she had enforced in her classroom for 34 years, one she mistakenly assumed did not apply to elite political discourse. Possessing the data does not automatically make a person correct, but lacking the data guarantees they are hopelessly unprepared. In her strictly run classroom, unpreparedness was an unforgivable offense, a blatant indicator that the essential homework had been ignored. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere in the Congresswoman's holding room was deteriorating rapidly. Her communications director stood with arms tightly crossed, glaring at a monitor while her phone vibrated relentlessly on a stack of ignored briefing materials. She had spent the last 6 minutes desperately texting warnings to a team that was essentially powerless to intervene while their boss was trapped under the studio lights. Recognizing the trap being methodically laid, she muttered to the empty room that her client needed to stop accepting the binary premise, as Shapiro was expertly constructing a rhetorical cage. The advisor watched in mounting frustration as Ocasio-Cortez plunged blindly into the next question, realizing it was far too late to pivot back to emotional storytelling. The trap had sprung. Shapiro systematically pivoted to the federal jobs guarantee, establishing the premise that every willing citizen would receive employment. He posed a critical operational question regarding the protocol for individuals who delivered grossly inadequate work. The Congresswoman suggested the implementation of performance standards, which Shapiro immediately challenged by asking if termination was a viable consequence. Ocasio-Cortez gripped her podium tightly, her physical strain mirroring the desperate attempt to reconcile two mutually exclusive political promises. She vaguely alluded to specialized processes for extreme situations. Shapiro struck with surgical precision, pointing out the inherent contradiction. If a worker can be terminated, the employment is not truly guaranteed. But if they cannot be fired, the government deliberately engineers an environment where competence and productivity are entirely irrelevant. He demanded she choose a side. When she accused him of fabricating a false binary, he clinically dismantled her defense. He stated the binary is a fundamental rule of logic, not a subjective political opinion. A guarantee inherently precludes the possibility of loss. While meaningful employment necessitates baseline performance, the two concepts simply cannot coexist. This illustrates the profound danger of legislating by slogan. Moving on, before she could mount a defense, Shapiro demonstrated the quiet dominance of a debater who knows he has thoroughly discredited an argument and refuses to waste time entertaining further spin. He targeted her self-identification as a democratic socialist, asking her to name a single nation where such policies had achieved undeniable success. As expected, she cited the Nordic models of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. Shapiro had clearly anticipated this exact cliché. Deploying a rare, perfectly timed pause, he quoted the Danish Prime Minister directly, who had explicitly demanded people stop labeling his country a planned socialist economy, firmly categorizing it as a robust market economy. Shapiro systematically dismantled the Swedish myth, pointing out their lack of a mandated minimum wage, the absence of an inheritance tax, and a universal school voucher system deeply rooted in free market principles. He mocked her reliance on nations that actively repudiate the very socialist label she champions, comparing it to hiring a committed vegetarian to market a steakhouse. In the Bronx, Dorothy meticulously noted the Danish Prime Minister's rejection of socialism and confidently etched a second and then a third definitive question mark into the Congresswoman's column. These were gaping voids where empirical evidence should have resided, representing embarrassing omissions from a representative trusted by a district where Dorothy had spent her entire adult life teaching children how to solve algebraic equations. Shapiro shifted tactics, announcing a final sequence of 3 sequential questions he wanted answered prior to offering his own rebuttal. First, he asked if she believed the ultra-wealthy should contribute their fair share, a premise she enthusiastically confirmed. Second, he asked her to specify a fair marginal tax rate for income exceeding $10 million, to which she confidently reiterated her public stance of 70%. Finally, he asked exactly how much federal revenue would be generated annually if the government simply confiscated every single dollar of income above that $10 million threshold at a 100% tax rate. Ocasio-Cortez visibly faltered, her mouth opening and closing in a quarter-second display of a mind desperately searching its archives only to find them completely barren. She stalled, claiming it depended on various factors. Shapiro stepped in to deliver the final blow. He cited Internal Revenue Service data indicating total national income above that threshold equaled roughly $650 billion. An unprecedented total confiscation of that wealth would yield precisely $650 billion. Holding up a single finger, he reminded her that the most conservative estimates from her own political allies placed the Green New Deal's annual cost between $500 billion and $1 trillion. Raising a second finger, he calculated her proposed 70% tax on that wealth pool would generate only $455 billion. He let the stark reality of that number hang heavy in the studio air. $455 billion falls drastically short of even the most optimistic low-end cost projections. He drove the point home with clarity. Even if the government enacted total wealth confiscation from the nation's top earners, it would not come close to balancing the ledger for her utopian vision. Gripping the podium, he asked a genuinely profound question, stripped of all rhetorical flourish, regarding exactly who is expected to cover the massive remaining deficit. At her desk, Dorothy rapidly crunched the numbers. $650 billion multiplied by 70% equals $455 billion. The requirement is a minimum of $500 billion to $1 trillion annually. The absolute best-case scenario leaves a catastrophic $45 billion shortfall. She stopped staring at the broadcast and looked up at her ceiling, contemplating a reality far more significant than a cable news debate. She thought of young Marcus and the millions of students across the nation who would eventually enter the workforce, open their hard-earned paychecks, and discover a massive chunk of their livelihood siphoned away to fund an ideological crusade whose very architect could not perform basic addition. The paper had revealed all it needed to. Ocasio-Cortez mounted a desperate defense, relying on the classic political crutch of theoretical economic growth to magically close the gaping fiscal canyon. Shapiro repeated the word growth with the weary tone of an educator dealing with a student whose answer is technically possible but practically absurd. He summarized her defense as hoping for miraculous economic expansion to erase a deficit guaranteed even under wildly optimistic projections. He paused one final time, delivering a devastating critique. He told her relying on such magical thinking is not a coherent economic strategy, it is blind faith. Lowering his voice to convey stark honesty, he noted his own deep religious convictions, but firmly stated that faith belongs in houses of worship, not in federal budget negotiations. He reiterated that he came armed only with questions, lacking institutional power, and she had failed to answer the three most critical inquiries of the night. He tallied the failures. First, a total blank on the overall cost of the initiative. Second, a total blank on who shoulders the financial burden when taxing the rich proves mathematically insufficient. Third, a total blank on the functional reality of a guaranteed jobs program stripped of accountability metrics. He concluded these glaring omissions were not accidental oversights, but the core feature of the policy itself. The proposal lacked mathematical grounding because the underlying math was fundamentally broken, and rather than admitting this, she took the intellectually lazy route of branding it a moral document to shame anyone asking for a receipt. He forcefully asserted that demanding financial accountability is exactly what responsible adults do before spending other people's hard-earned money. It is precisely the standard a Bronx math teacher enforces every single day. And if middle schoolers are expected to complete their assignments, a sitting member of Congress should be held to the same basic standard. Given the opportunity to respond, Ocasio-Cortez stood before millions of viewers, desperately searching for a statement to magically erase the devastating voids Shapiro had exposed. She realized any statistic she offered would be instantly fact-checked and dismantled by an opponent who processed data with the ruthless efficiency of a legal calculator. She had learned the hard way that attempting to spar with numbers against Ben Shapiro was akin to handing loaded ammunition to a sharpshooter, opting for strategic silence over further humiliation. Her voice lost its commanding edge, reducing to a thin shadow of its former self. She offered a hollow, 7-word platitude about building the future. It was a meaningless slogan offered exactly where concrete policy was desperately required, a flimsy poster taped over a missing foundational blueprint. The debate footage exploded online, amassing 30 million views before midnight, universally dubbed a mathematical massacre. The 60-second highlight reel permeated every digital platform across the globe. Backstage, the communications advisor slammed her laptop shut in sheer despair, knowing the damage was irreversible. Progressive advocacy groups rushed to issue defensive statements, yet spectacularly, none dared to include a single cost projection. A prominent journalist pointed out this glaring omission, inflicting more structural damage than anything said on the debate stage by independently validating the complete absence of fiscal reality within the movement. In her Bronx apartment, Dorothy Chen powered down her television and reviewed her ledger. Shapiro's side was densely packed with precise figures ranging from $93 trillion to $455 billion, along with 70% and 100%. The opposing side contained only vague buzzwords like growth and moral document. She carefully packed the paper away, knowing exactly how to handle Marcus' inevitable question the next morning. She would place the undeniable data right on his desk, showing him that one side brought the math while the other brought nothing but blanks. She would remind him that in the real world, submitting a blank page earns a failing grade. She intended to teach him that if someone demands your support but actively refuses to show you the math, it is guaranteed the math simply does not work. In Washington, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat in the quiet isolation of her kitchen, staring at a hastily scribbled napkin. Away from the cameras, she finally did the calculations herself, double-checking the figures with a desperate hope of proving her opponent wrong. The inescapable reality stared back at her. $455 billion was unequivocally less than the required $500 billion. The math failed at a 70% tax rate, it failed at 80%, and it completely imploded even under a draconian 100% total confiscation model. She closed her laptop in defeat. The undeniable truth written on her napkin perfectly matched the calculations a dedicated teacher completed in the Bronx. Neither woman was aware of the other, yet both arrived at the exact same devastating conclusion because empirical truth remains stubbornly immune to political spin. Back in the studio, Ben Shapiro sat quietly in a folding chair, sipping water. He was not gloating, he was analyzing the profound silence he had extracted. Over 15 years of debating, he developed an acute ear for the specific kind of silence that occurs when an opponent realizes their ideological framework has just collapsed under the weight of basic scrutiny. That silence was the sound of a policy fundamentally bankrupt from its inception. He reflected briefly on the hypothetical Bronx math teacher he had referenced, completely unaware she actually existed, that she had been watching, and that she had destroyed the Congresswoman's economic theories 6 seconds before he did. It ultimately does not matter who performs the calculations because the integrity of the math stands independent of the messenger. 3 elementary questions yielded 3 gaping voids, exposing a $93 trillion ideological fantasy utterly devoid of financial grounding. A 7th grade teacher proved it with nothing more than a pencil, beating a sitting congresswoman to the punch. If you value intellectual honesty, hit subscribe, drop the word math in the comments, and share this breakdown with anyone who still buys into the illusion that this utopian pipe dream costs the taxpayers nothing.